It's going to be a long one, y'all. Bear with me. Speed up to 2x if you have to, because this is important information, or come back later. This is for my thinkers, my knowledge seekers, people who want to know. The American slave trade was separate than the transatlantic. Why I look up American slave trade and only the transatlantic shows up? No, the American slave trade was after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished. And they closed the borders of America, and they did slavery within American walls. And then that's when they tried to buy Cuba, telling the American people with their tax dollars, they said, oh, we want to buy Cuba to force them to stop the slave trade, when really they wanted to buy Cuba so they can continue to slave trade between Cuba and America. Because remember, Brazil had fell out. They had got out of there like year 1815, because the transatlantic slave trade ended in 1808. The American slave trade did not end until 1865 and longer. So like I said, the transatlantic slave trade and the American slave trade are two different things. If you do not know about them, please learn you something, because I am not ashamed to say I didn't really understand the complexities myself, and I'm American. I'm a Black American from the South, and I didn't even really understand the complexities until a lot recently. This shit is, they try to make it hidden knowledge, but it's not. If you look up the American slave trade, I'm not talking about the transatlantic. The American slave trade was within the transatlantic. Go ahead and leave a comment below and tell me if you know the difference, if you know about this, if there's anything you'd like to say. I think people really need to study the American slave trade, not just the transatlantic, because shit gets a lot spookier than you think. Why am I bringing this up? In the American slave trade, this is where we had breeding farms. I just heard buck breaking. This is where we had breeding farms. Why? Because they were no longer able to traffic and trade people, human beings, as fucking cargo. They were no longer able to do that from Africa and Brazil and all these other places. They had to do it within the American walls. This is when the value of the enslaved person switched from the male to the female. This shit gets deep. This is a passion of mine. I've read a lot of books on this, and I've done a lot of studying and had a lot of personal conversations with people. This is all documented. This is not some weird conspiracy. This really happened. Listen to what I'm saying. After 1808, when the transatlantic slave trade was abolished by Great Britain, that is when America closed their borders and started breeding camps. And then the woman became more valuable because she was able to have babies. So then the men used to cost more. The male slaves used to cost more because, they were strong and they could do labor. But like I said, after Britain stopped the slave trade, quote unquote, that's when it switched from males being more expensive to women being more expensive, especially women that have had babies and can carry more babies. This is how this goes into the race of Black or ethnicity. I always get it confused, but I know that Black Americans are specifically called Black race, Anyway, that's a different topic. But remember, when they talk about the I think it was the ethno state, please forgive me if you know the word, tell me down below, but it's like the ethno something that we are. And it's because of the American slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, but specifically the American slave trade. This is where a lot of the inbreeding, I don't want to say inbreeding, like I'm trying to be respectful, but this is where a lot of shit happened, like the mixture and all that. I mean, it was already happening before that, but then it was promoted after 1808. Isn't that fucking insane? And I came on here looking crazy as fuck because when I was just in the spirit, and then I looked on TikTok, I put in American slave trade, and for the American slave trade, they only put up the transatlantic slave trade. I was like, no, that's a whole different slave trade. The American slave trade was the most brutal slave trade ever. I didn't say transatlantic, I said American. This is another reason why Black Americans, we get so hell bent on telling our story and being truthful, because I don't think people really we don't even always get it. This shit is hidden knowledge. Really, it shouldn't be, but it is. But like I said, the American slave trade was a different type of brutality because they had to force humans to be made. It's like they went against God even more. Because if you remember, when it came to the islands, the Caribbean and stuff, a lot of the enslaved people were dying at fast rates. And the slave owners didn't care because they could just buy another one. Well, like I said, when the transatlantic slave trade got abolished, they didn't want their slaves to die anymore, because if their slaves died, who's going to do the labor? So now they started to, like I said, treat it differently, because women were more valuable, because women could create more slaves. This is also why when we talk about race, it gets really complex, because if the slave master raped an enslaved woman and the baby came out mixed, that baby was literally chattel. The baby was still a slave. He did that to make more slaves. He did that to make more property. Oh, God.